السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Left off last week in the course of our discussion of Ijma and its role in Tafsir. And there's really just one last point of discussion left concerning Ijma and Tafsir, and that's what we'll be picking up with today. But just to recap very quickly, the conclusion that Sheikh Hatim reached is that, as it says here, إن منع الخروج عن مجموع أقوال السلف إنما يصح بشرطين. So it's disallowed to go outside of the reported أقوال of the Salaf when two conditions are met. الأول أن يكون قد تحقق في المنقول عنهم قرائن تدل على أنه ليس لهم فهم للآية إلا الفهم المنقول. أنه لو كان لهم قول وفهم آخر في الآية للزم أن يكون منقولا. Given the importance of the naql, given the importance of the issue that is being discussed, and obviously the reason for this shart is because, as we said, clearly we can say without a shadow of a doubt that not every single understanding that any of the Salaf had of the ayahs of the Quran has been reported to us. So therefore, simply seeing that these are the aqwal that have been reported on a particular verse, on a particular issue, does not necessarily mean that going outside of those aqwal is going outside of their ijma, because there's not an ijma that is established that these are the only possible aqwal concerning this verse. الثاني أن يكون القول المخالف يبطل قول السلف الذي رجحنا وتيقنا أنه لا فهم لهم غيره. Okay, so this goes without saying that if the interpretation that we are offering or that we are considering adopting goes outside of what is reported from them, but it doesn't nullify what they said. In other words, it can be looked at as an additional meaning that can be taken from the ayah that does not contradict these interpretations. So it could very well mean what is reported from the Salaf, but in addition, there is this additional meaning here that none of them pointed out. At least in what is reported from them, none of them pointed out. In which case, that's perfectly fine. If it negates their qawl, that is where the problem comes up. If it negates their qawl or the aqwal that are reported from them, and we've made a determination with ghalabat al-dhann or yaqeen that if there was another understanding of this verse, it would have been reported. Here, going outside of their aqwal becomes impermissible. In any case, there's one last discussion concerning a passage from Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah about this topic that is worth a quick examination, because it ties into what we've been discussing about the understanding of the underlying premise on which these shurut are based, and based on which how we're going to deal with these sorts of interpretations. قال شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية ولهذا قال كثير منهم، من كثير من الأصوليين، maybe means المتكلمين here, but regardless, the aqwal that he's quoting are all aqwal of أصوليين in أصول الفقه books. ولهذا قال كثير منهم كأبي الحسين البصري ومن تبعه كالرازي والعامدي وابن الحاجب إن الأمة إذا اختلفت في تأويل الآية على قولين جاز لمن بعدهم إحداث قول ثالث بخلاف ما إذا اختلفوا في الأحكام على قولين. So a number of the usuliyin have mentioned a distinction. So in the issue of ta'wil of the ayat, ta'wil of the nusus, they've allowed the introduction of a new qawl. Remember we talked about the issue, the notion of ihdath qawl thalith. So in ta'wil of ayat, they said ihdath qawl thalith is fine. بخلاف ما إذا اختلفوا في الأحكام على قول. Unlike أحكام. In أحكام إحداث قول ثالث is ممنوع. Now we're going to look at how Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah has understood this point and the critique that he makes, and then how Shaykh Hatim, his interpretation of this this view of these usuli. فجوزوا, this is still Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah speaking, فجوزوا أن تكون الأمة مجتمعة. فجوزوا أن تكون الأمة مجتمعة على الضلال في تفسير القرآن والحديث، وأن يكون الله أنزل الآية وأراد بها معنى لم يفهمه الصحابة والتابعون، ولكن قالوا إن الله أراد معنى آخر. Again, this comes back to what we discussed about is what is reported from them necessarily the interpretation of all of them, or is it possible that there are other interpretations in these generations that have not been reported to us? ولكن قالوا إن الله أراد معنى آخر. Now, obviously, now this is a very serious point. That if this is what they're saying, this is a very serious claim, as we discussed. So, Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah makes clear that he's not actually saying that this is what they actually believe. This is the lazim of the premise that they have adopted, not realizing that it has this lazim which is false. So he says, وهم لو تصوروا هذه المقالة لم يقولوا هذا. So if they really understood the implications of what they're saying, they wouldn't have adopted this view, because the implications are ones that they would recognize are false. فإن أصلهم أن الأمة لا تجتمع على ضلالة ولا يقولون قولين كلاهما خطأ والصواب قول ثالث لم يقولوه. So الأمة لا تجتمع على ضلالة. This is a fundamental point. You see, in their discussions on Ijma, when you read their discussions, you'll see that they come back to this point. الأمة لا تجتمع على ضلالة ولا يقولون so therefore ولا يقولون قولين كلاهما خطأ والصواب قول ثالث لم يقولوه. لكن قد اعتادوا أن يتأولوا ما خالفهم، والتأويل عندهم مقصوده بيان احتمال في لفظ الآية بجواز أن يراد ذلك المعنى بذلك اللفظ، ولم يستشعروا أن المتأول هو مبين لمراد الآية مخبر عن الله تعالى أنه أراد هذا المعنى إذا حملها على معنى. وكذلك إذا قالوا يجوز أن يراد بها هذا المعنى والأمة قبلهم لم يقولوا أريد بها إلا هذا أو هذا، فقد جوزوا أن يكون ما أراده الله لم يخبر به الأمة وأخبرت أن مراده غير ما أراده. لكن الذي قاله هؤلاء يتمشى إذا كان التأويل أنه يجوز أن يراد هذا المعنى من غير حكم بأنه مراد، وتكون الأمة قبلهم كلها كانت جاهلة بمراد الله ضالة عن معرفته، وانقرض عصر الصحابة والتابعين وهم لم يعلموا معنى الآية. ولكن طائفة قالت يجوز أن يريد هذا المعنى، وطائفة قالت يجوز أن يريد هذا المعنى، وليس فيهم من علم المراد. فجاء الثالث وقال ها هنا معنى يجوز أن يكون هو المراد. فإذا كانت الأمة من الجهل بمعاني القرآن والضلال عن مراد الرب بهذه الحال توجه ما قالوه، وبسط هذا له موضوع آخر. Without going into too much detail about what he said, if you read his discussion, it's clear that the premise that he is working from is that going outside of their aqwal necessitates that none of them understood the ayah, and that the correct understanding of the ayah was lost. And that would be true in cases where the shurut are met that we discussed. That we can say with confidence that if there was another interpretation of this verse in the time of the Sahaba and Tabi'in, we can be confident that it would have been reported to us. And that might be true for some verses and some aqwal, but it's not true for the whole of the Quran, as we discussed. And again, one of the indications of that is that oftentimes for many verses you won't find any explanation from is reported from any of the Sahaba to begin with, or Tabi'in, or you will find that that just that there's only a solitary report from Qatada, for example. So clearly then, not everything that they understood from the Quran has been reported to us. So Sheikh Hatim says, وقفات سريعة مع هذا النص الذي سبقت مناقشة فكرته. أولا لم يقف عند تفريقهم بين الحكم والتفسير، مع أن الحكم فرع التفسير. What does that mean, الحكم فرع التفسير? When you make a hukum based on what? Kitab, Sunnah, Ijma, Qiyas. Even if we take into consideration other adillah, secondary adillah, these other adillah are coming back to Quran and Sunnah. Even Qiyas is coming back to Quran and Sunnah. Ijma is coming back to Quran and Sunnah. You don't have Ijma, Quran and Sunnah here, and then Ijma is like Ijma on something that's in the Torah and the Injil. Ijma is on the muradat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger in the Quran and Sunnah. Qiyas is qiyas based on the meanings of ahkam that are present in the Quran and Sunnah. So to do qiyas on even doing qiyas on something, arriving at a hukam by qiyas, first you have to determine that there is this hukam in the Sharia on which qiyas can be made. And that hukam is going to be made based on interpretation of nusus. So anytime you're reaching a hukam, there's first going to be nusus that you are interpreting. So the hukam comes after this process of interpreting the nusus. So الحكم فرع التفسير. ثانيا نسب إليهم ما لم يقولوه وما لا يلزم من قولهم لم يفهمه الصحابة والتابعون على ما سبق بيانه. I think this should be clear now that this is not necessary unless you assume that they're understanding all of their interpretations the way that all of them understood it has necessarily been reported to us in each and every case, or at least in the case that is up for discussion, up for dispute. والصواب أن هؤلاء العلماء قد فرقوا بين الأحكام والتفسير لا تناقضا منهم، وإنما لأن أصول الأحكام مسائل تعم بها البلوى وتتوفر الدواعي على نقلها. And the reality is, it is not true even for all ahkam. As it says here, أصول الأحكام وتتوفر الدواعي على نقلها. وأما باقي معاني التفسير, generally tafsir of the nusus beyond things that are dealing with usul al-ahkam or even usul al-aqaid, Um, فليست كذلك غالبا. For the most part, they're not the same as um, they're not the same as the usul ahkam, in the sense that um, it's such an important hukum. It's something that is under discussion. Everyone is concerned about it, such that if someone was expressing an opinion, inevitably there would be um, expectation that it is going to be transmitted. That brings us to the end of our discussion about Ijma. الحاجة إلى التجديد في التفسير. Um, here, Sheikh Hatim speaks about 4 ways in which um, there's need for tajdeed in tafsir. Basically, remember we talked about that the idea of tajdeed and tafsir is intimately tied to the idea of ijtihad. And anyone who is doing any sort of tajdeed in tafsir inevitably has to be someone who has the tools of ijtihad, alatul ijtihad. Um, Otherwise, he can't really do tajdeed in tafsir. So we want to now establish that there's a need for tafsir. We want to now establish there's a need for tafsir. There's a need for tajdeed. Um, and so Shaykh Hatim lists 4 points in this section about the need for tafsir, the need for tajdeed in tafsir. The first is that the Quran is guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for mankind um, until Qiyam Sa'ah, until the hour. And so therefore, and it's for all matters, guidance for all matters. And so therefore there will always be a need to extract guidance from it. The second point he mentions is the command to do tadabbur of the Quran is addressed to the Muslim Ummah, and so therefore it is a wajib kifai, part kifaya, that there must always be someone who is capable of fulfilling uh, this command. The third he mentions is that in reality, doing tarjih between the ikhtilafat of the mufassirin requires someone who is a mujtahid. Um, and then the fourth point is uh, that as for the tafsir that is reported from the Salaf, only part of it fulfills the conditions. Only a small part of it fulfills the conditions of ijma or ijma murakkab, as we discussed. And so that means that the scope of ijtihad is still open. We'll just take a look briefly at each of these points. القرآن هداية الله للبشرية إلى قيام الساعة. إن هذا القرآن يهدي للتي هي أقوم. And if we look in the modern era in particular, as he mentions here, أحوال الناس تتبدل تبدلا قويا وسريعا، خاصة في هذا الأسر، وتتجدد لهم من القضايا بقدر هذا التسارع في التقوى والفجور. This is actually a reference to the famous ibara that is reported from Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and Imam Malik. يحدث للناس أقضية بقدر ما يحدثون من الفجور. It says that in reality that fujur is not the only reason. Now, why would they say this in the early centuries of Islam, when life was perhaps much simpler, and the rate of change and the nature of life was much simpler? A lot of the new issues that were coming about were simply coming about because of people doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. And so there is a relationship between that changes are happening because people are getting involved in things that they shouldn't be. And so, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, for example, when um, the Prophet ﷺ did judge cases, and he had appointed Sahaba who did judge cases. And in the time of Al Khulafa al Rashidun, um, they appointed judges and they judged cases. But someone might be a judge. I think it's reported that Umar was judge for Abu Bakr, and hardly anyone in that time brought him any case. So if there's nothing to dispute, then there's not a lot of need for new fatawa, for issues that are not already the hukam of which is not already well established. But clearly, in the modern age that we live, there has been so much radical change, good or bad. Uh, there's been so much radical change in the the makeup of human societies, um, such as the movement of populations from uh, largely rural areas, um, from countryside to large cities the likes of which were unprecedented in human history. And now majority of people actually live in urban societies. The nature of the societies, the makeup, the structure of the societies is radically different. You no longer have um, the strong attachment to your village, to your tribe, to your extended family. And obviously, some of these are not necessarily good or bad. It's just simply the way that the nature of um, the types of changes that are happening impose these sorts of conditions. And there are other things that are, in fact, of course, bad. They're not. They are problematic. There are things that are a result of um, the very different priorities that the Western civilization has, and Western civilization, for better or for worse, is now basically global civilization, and their culture is now basically global culture. And so the standards and um, priorities of that culture are now what is driving um, human civilization. But and aside from that, also you have the sheer complexity of um, the modern economic system, the challenges that it presents, um, and so there's a host of innumerable issues that have arisen in the modern era and continue to arise. An example of this, in fact, is a friend of mine, brother Omar Usman, who some of you might know from social media or what have you. One of his projects that he's been working on for quite some time is what he calls the fiqh of social media. And he actually has a book that is coming out soon called The Fiqh of Social Media. And this is something that he's been doing seminars on, and trying to educate people for quite some time, that that the rise of social media has changed the way that we live our lives. It's changed the way that it's changed the way that the technology in general has changed the way that we live our lives. It's changed the way that we engage in personal relationships, and so there are certain things, certain issues that arise from that require guidance, and there is indeed guidance for this in the Book of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala and the Sunnah of His Messenger, and inshallah his book will actually be coming out very soon with the title of Social Media. He tries to, in a very brief fashion, hit the most important points concerning the issues that have arisen from the rise of social media and computers and what have you, or technology, I should say, that it has created, and providing some guidance for that in light of Islamic principles, which are timeless, but these issues are new. Um, And so it goes without saying that since these issues are new and the principles might be timeless, but it goes without saying then that the specific issues are not addressed in the books of fiqh, or in the books of tafsir, or in the books of in the commentaries on the relevant hadiths. You're not going to have a lot of these issues addressed particularly, and so it is the job of those who are capable and qualified, which requires obviously a certain degree of ijtihad, to derive that guidance, or to take that guidance and work at applying it to the situations that arise, or the issues that arise. And obviously, in some cases, the principles might themselves be principles that are well established and clear. And in some cases, what you find is that what is tricky is actually understanding the issues, the practical issues. And so it's only after understanding the waqi' of people, understanding the actual realities that they're facing, the issues that they're facing, the nature of those issues, that you'll be able to apply those principles. So sometimes there's also a gap between the ulama who perhaps have a good understanding of the principles and the rulings and priorities of the Sharia, and between experts, subject matter experts, who might have expertise in the particular issues. And so sometimes there's a need also for some synergistic cooperation between the two parties to provide guidance for these types of things. But there's no doubt that certainly that a degree of ijtihad in the ulum, and that includes ijtihad, of course, in tafsir, because obviously the first source of ahkam, and the first source of guidance, I should say, because it's not just limited to ahkam fiqhiyya, is in the Quran, and then of course in the Sunnah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Sheikh Hatim mentions, for example, that there's even guidance that can be taken from the Quran, and should be taken from the Quran, when it comes to dealing with psychological issues, dealing with family issues, dealing with social issues that the modern era creates, political and security issues. All of this requires that the interpretation of the Quran, ijtihad and interpretation of the Quran. Second point, أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا أفلا يتدبرون القرآن أم على قلوب أقفالها كتاب أنزلناه إليك مبارك ليتدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. These ayahs command us as Muslims to continue with the tadabbur of the Quran until إلى أن يرث الله الأرض ومن عليها, until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us all up, until the very end of this ummah. And obviously this begins with the need for general people to do tadabbur of the Quran. Even the Ammi should have some degree of tadabbur of the Quran, to contemplate its lessons, its reminders, and so therefore, based on that, to adhere to its teachings. And the pinnacle of that is the tadabbur of the reflection and contemplation of specialists who have the ala of ijtihad. وما دام هذا الأمر خطاب للمسلمين إلى قيام الساعة فيجب أن يوجد في المسلمين من يقوم بواجبه الكفائي إلى قيام الساعة أيضا. واستنباط الفوائد الخفية والحكمة المجموعة في داخل التفسير الظاهري مدد تفسيري لا تنقضي عجائب القرآن فيه. Obviously, this is what taken from the description of the Quran that is reported from Ali. It's actually reported as a marfu hadith, but as Ibn Kathir, but it's a weak hadith. It's a weak hadith, but as Ibn Kathir states, it's more likely that it is the words of Ali anhu himself describing the Quran. وَلَا تَنْقَضِي عَجَائِبُ. And إذا كانت لا تنقضي عجائب, then no doubt there will always be scope for those who have a deep understanding of the Quran, who have the specialist qualifications to ijtihad and interpretation of the Quran, to continue drawing meanings from it. The third point Sheikh Hatim mentions, حاجة اختلافات المفسرين إلى المجدد. And this is interesting. ففرق كبير بين ترجيح المجتهد وترجيح المقلد. ترجيح المجتهد هو مع العلم بمآخذ المختلفين، فلا يعتمد في ترجيحه على ما يبرزه السابقون من الأدلة، ولا على ترجيح المقلد للأعلم أو لما عليه الأكثرون، فهذا كله هو ترجيح المقلدين. أما ترجيحات المجتهد فهي تنطلق من منطلقات أهل الاجتهاد نفسها، ولا يقف عند أقوالهم إلا وقفة المتأكد المتثبت من استيعاب نظره واجتهاده لأبعاد القول ومآخذ المسألة صبرا وتقسيما. Okay, now the difference between the mujtahid and the muqallid. Obviously, you have people who are specialized in tafsir, but for all intents and purposes, they are muqallid. They've studied tafsir, they've studied perhaps certain books in tafsir, maybe they teach those books in tafsir. They're familiar with the aqwal, they're familiar even with the adillah that are mentioned, the arguments that are mentioned by at least some of the mufassirin, if not all of the mufassirin. Certainly, knowing what all of the mufassirin have said is almost, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it is a very daunting task, because the Turath is so vast, and even if you were to read everything that has been published, which is a tremendous amount, then you still have works that are yet to be published. So it's a very daunting task to read everything that everyone has said and be sure that you haven't missed anything. But regardless, you have people who they're specialized in tafsir, perhaps they're professors in university setting or in madrasa setting. They teach tafsir. They're specializing in studying tafsir, focusing most of their time on tafsir, having read major works of tafsir. But their engagement with tafsir is still largely the engagement of a muqallid. And so when the muqallid does tarjih, he's doing tarjih largely based on who does he trust more, the authority of whom does he trust more, or what he finds this is what most of the mufassirin seem to be saying, or at least in his estimation, because obviously sometimes it's difficult to make a determination. What does the majority say? How do you determine who's the majority? Again, that comes back to the issue of, well, have you read what everyone has said? And so it can be sometimes difficult to make a determination of what is the majority anyways. But assuming that he's made a determination, rightly or wrongly, of what is the majority, then perhaps he takes what the majority is saying simply because they are the majority. And in a sense, there's no blame on the muqallid for doing that. It's perfectly reasonable. That is the role of the muqallid. And there's obviously, it's not possible that everyone will become a mujtahid. And nor do we want to create a free-for-all where everyone is who without qualifications is now speaking about the Quran. As for the mujtahid, when he engages with the ikhtilafat of Mufassirin. So with the mujtahid and the muqallid, they're looking at the same ikhtilafat. They're looking at the same aqwal, the same adilla. But the engagement of the mujtahid is different from the engagement of the muqallid. For him, he's able to engage with the tafsir, with the text of the verse, and also the other tools that the Mufassir needs directly. He's able to analyze them for himself. He's not simply dependent on, well, this qawl has been justified by this alim in this fashion, and so I don't find this reasoning very compelling. That might be the case. That reasoning might not be very compelling. But for example, if Ibn Abbas has made a qawl in tafsir of certain verse, oftentimes his tafsir is simply reported to us as Ibn Abbas said this. It's not reported to us as Ibn Abbas said this, and then he said, and the reason this is the correct interpretation is because of X, Y, Z. So you might find a later scholar actually providing a justification for Ibn Abbas's quote. You might find multiple justifications given for Ibn Abbas. But the difference between being able to do ijtihad and not being able to do ijtihad is that the mujtahid is able to discover the rationale that is underlying these different aqwal. He has a good grasp of what are possible compelling reasons for adopting this qawl. And so he's not simply dependent on, well, I found Fulan said that Ibn Abbas, that this qawl, which is attributed to Ibn Abbas, that its justification for it is this, and I don't find that very compelling. And it actually might not be very compelling. It might not be very compelling. The problem with that is that doing tarjih simply based on, well, this is the justification that I found, and I found it to not be very compelling. Okay, it might not be very compelling, but there might actually be a very compelling reason for this qawl of Ibn Abbas. And so this is the problem when the muqallid does tarjih. The muqallid's tarjih is still taqlid. Even if he's looking at the adillah, it's still taqlid, because as long as the ala of ijtihad is not there, now obviously it might be a more informed taqlid, it might be a more refined taqlid than the taqlid ammi. The ammi, he maybe, he attends a dars in the masjid, and someone says to him, this verse, that's what it means, because that's what I heard the sheikh in the masjid say. And obviously he's got a big turban, so he doesn't know what he's talking about, That obviously is the taqlid of the ammi, but the taqlid of the alim, the person who's a learned person, is still taqlid. It's a more informed taqlid, it might be a more refined taqlid, but it's still taqlid, because at the end of the day, he's lacking in terms of his capability. He's lacking in terms of his capability to derive the meanings for himself. He's lacking in his capability to appreciate and determine the reasoning that is underlying. He's lacking in his ability to appreciate and deduce the reasoning that underlies these aqwal. And so as it says here, when the mujtahid, when he's going through these books and he's looking at these different aqwal and he's looking at the justifications that have been offered for them, this is just to make sure that he hasn't missed anything. He himself is analyzing these things and arriving at his own understanding of them, but he might still miss something. Obviously, and again, this is an important point. Say someone is a mujtahid, even the idea of mujtahid mutlaq, we're not talking about here right now, but the mujtahid mutlaq for him and other early imams who are mujtahid mutlaq. Mujtahid mutlaq means that having full capability to engage with issues of of ilm, or of fiqh, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't mean you're Superman. It doesn't mean you can leap tall buildings in a single bound, and know all of the aqwal and know all of the evidences, and that you never miss anything. That's not what it means. Oftentimes I think, particularly as we're now removed over 1,000 years from the four imams, and I don't mean by this any sort of belittlement of them, because they're genuinely deserving of the respect that they're given, absolutely 100%. But being so far removed from them, and the deep reverence that we hold them in, and the deep reverence that they're deserving of. Let me be clear here: it's deep reverence that they're deserving of. But sometimes it can be easy to lose sight of their humanity. They're human beings. They are human beings. So even with the great mujtahids, they're still they're also dependent on others. Uh, you want to engage with what everyone who has something of value to say, because you will learn from them. Even if you're more knowledgeable than them, you will still learn something from them. You can still benefit from them. And so the mujtahid then is a necessary part of the process of ijtihad, is that he's going to engage with all of this turath. He's not just simply going to say, I'm going to throw it all out the window and reinvent the wheel. That's not what ijtihad means. That's not what ijtihad means. A person who's saying that I'm going to throw it all out the window and reinvent the wheel. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, I think we've seen some of this in the modern era with ijtihad fiqhi. That we have these two extremes between people who want us to stick to what is the dhahir of the madhab, for example, or the mu'tamad of the madhab in particular issues, even without actually understanding the rationale underlying it. And as a result of having a poor, deficient understanding of the rationale, even when it comes to doing taqleed, they don't do taqleed properly, because the job of the muqallid at the very least is to understand where the qawl of the madhab is coming from, what's its ma'khad, and to do ijtihad in tahqiq al-manat, in applying that qawl. To ijtihad in tahqiq al-manat, in applying that qawl. So even to apply it properly requires a certain degree of ijtihad. So we have sometimes on one extreme a severe sort of allergy to ijtihad, and then on the other hand, we have the other extreme, where not only are people saying, let's reinvent the wheel. We've got these guys saying, well, there's no dalil that the wheel has to be round. Who said the wheel has to be round? I'm fine, okay, I accept that wheels have always been round, but who's to say that a wheel couldn't be square? Maybe it's actually a bid'ah to insist that all wheels be round. This is where we're at. We have these two extremes where you end up with on the one extreme, and again, I'm saying this is the extremes. I'm not saying that everybody is either here or there, but these are the extremes. You have on the one end a complete and utter opposition to any sort of ijtihad, the end result of which is oftentimes poor application of the fiqh that exists and the aqwal that exists. And the opposite end, you have this sorts of ridiculous ijtihadat that in reality, if we look at what is the common link between these two extremes, it's incompetence. The people who are at this extreme are incompetent, and the people who are in this extreme are incompetent. Although obviously I think the do-it-yourself ijtihad without qualifications is probably on the whole more dangerous. But the people who are on the opposite extreme are a fitna. They're fitna for the ones who are on this extreme, and the ones who are on this extreme are a fitna for the ones who are on the opposite extreme. And the common factor between both people on both ends, both extremes, is their relative incompetence. In case I have no idea how we're talking about tafsir. So, تجديد من تفسير. Number 4. إذا كانت أكثر أحد أقوال التفسير Okay, this is what we talked about before. That there are certain scenarios in which tafsir of Salaf is hujjah, as we discussed. Much of the tafsir that is reported outside from them does not fit those scenarios. It's not fi hukm al-marfu'. It's not something that is simply transmission of the language as it is, in which case their transmission of the language is hujjah because they're the source of the language. And it's not something constitutes ijma sukuti or murakkab. So means that much of the Quran, the scope for ijtihad is still open. And one of the strongest indications of that is that there's hardly a major mufassir, someone who could be considered mujtahid in tafsir, starting from Imam Tabari himself, as we saw down through the centuries, except that he doesn't strictly adhere in all the ayat of the Quran to staying inside of what is reported from the Salaf and that interpretation of that particular person. And this is almost a universal trend, if not a universal trend. So clearly, they understood that they were not actually going against ijma in these things, in these aqwal that they were adopting. Just coming back to the point about ijtihad very quickly. So the difference between the mujtahid and the muqallid in tafsir is that the muqallid might be a learned person. He might be familiar with the issues of tafsir. He might be familiar with the aqwal. He might be familiar with arguments and justifications and evidences that are used. But the real ability to weigh those things is not there, or at the very least, it's lacking. I mean, it's not going to be completely absent, because for it to be it would only be completely absent if he's altogether ignorant about tafsir to begin with. But what happens is, when you learn to drive a car, you can have studied the how to drive a car in theory and learned all of the rules and all of the guidelines and all of the recommendations and the ins and outs of how the car works. But if you never practice it, you're not going to be very good at it. And so likewise with the muqallid, even if he's very learned, if he hasn't actually applied using the tools of tafsir to do tafsir, then he's not going to be very comfortable doing it. He's not going to be very proficient in doing it, no matter how much his theoretical study is. Okay, so then Sheikh Hatim has one last section dealing with tajdeed, where he lists sur at-tajdeed fi tafsir. There's 10 of them. I'm just going to go through them very quickly, and that will bring us to the end of our discussion on tajdeed. So the first one he mentions استخراج معان جديدة لم يسبق إليه المفسرون ومنه الفهم الجديد المخالف للمنقول عن السلف بشرط أن يكون في المحل الذي يجوز فيه الخروج عن مجموع أقوالهم. I think this is pretty clear in light of what we've discussed already. الصورة الثانية محاكمة بعض الأقوال القديمة للانتقال بها من درجة الاختلاف اللفظي إلى الاختلاف الحقيقي المرجوح، من درجة الاختلاف التضاد السائغ المرجوح إلى درجة الاختلاف غير السائغ وإلى إبطال ذلك القول. So something that might have seemed in the past a reasonable interpretation might actually conclude today that it is actually a false interpretation based on new information. But again, who's going to be able to make that judgment? It requires someone who actually mujtahid in tafsir. So for example, he mentions here أنزلنا من المعصرات ماء ثجاجا. He says that there's two opinions about al-mu'asirat, that it refers to the sky and it refers to the clouds. Ibn Jarir and Ibn Kathir both concluded that the correct interpretation is that it is the clouds, but they used in preferring it, they said is it arjah or al-azhar. It's a stronger opinion. But he says أما اليوم في العلم الحديث يأبى أن يثبت غير السحاب بغض النظر عن ماذا يكون مصدر ماء ذلك السحاب. As for in terms of what we know now with modern science, clearly it has to be clouds. In any case, with this example, he has some lengthy discussion. We're not going to go into it. It's worth reading. He mentions another example: إن الله عنده علم الساعة وينزل الغيث ويعلم ما في الأرحام ما تدري نفس ماذا تكسب غدا ما تدري نفس بأي أرض تموت إن الله عليم خبير. قتادة says فلا يعلم أحد ما في الأرحام ذكر أم أنثى أحمر أم أسود. أحمر here would basically mean white skinned or red, white skinned or black skinned, male or female, etc. And it's reported from Mujahid that he said a man came to the Prophet ﷺ. This is now mursal from Mujahid. So Prophet ﷺ. There's a gap here. Says a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, "My wife is pregnant. So tell me, what will she give birth to? And our land that I come from is barren. It's dry. When will rain fall?" So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this verse. It's according to the report from Mujahid that this is the sabab nuzul. But it is, as we see, a mursal report. الشيخ حاتم says وما أحسن كلام ابن جرير وتوقفه عند الظاهر بلا خوض في التفصيل الموقع في الزلل، حيث قال ويعلم ما في الأرحام، أرحام الإناث. So Ibn Jarir doesn't go beyond in actually giving his preference of how to explain the verse. He doesn't go beyond simply saying that arham here refers to the womb of females, the wombs of females. He doesn't actually go into the details of what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone knows about the contents of the wombs, because that is where the problem arises. Because today it's become possible to know the gender of the fetus. In fact, it's become possible to know with certainty. And so as a result, we have to conclude that the interpretation of Qatada, which was a reasonable interpretation at the time that he made it, is incorrect. And also that the Mursal report from Mujahid, which obviously Mursal report is weak. When we say that a report is weak, that means that its likelihood of being authentic, barring the existence of other evidence that supports it, other narrations that support it, is low. It's not likely. It's possible, but it's not likely. It's possible that what is being reported is true, but it's not likely. That's again assuming that there's no other reports that support it. Um, but now that we know this is not the case, and we know that this is not what tafsir, this could not be what the verse means, we can conclude with certainty that Mujahid's Mursal report is inauthentic. So then Sheikh Hatim then discusses how then can the verse be interpreted. He mentions two possible explanations. And you'll note in both cases, he's also supported those explanations with certain hadiths that support the possible explanations that he's offering. Um, the third scenario he mentions, ربط التفسير بالواقع. This is something we already talked about a bit. فإن تنزيل الوحي على الواقع من وظيفة المجتهد وقد يخفى على أكثر الناس. And as he says here, وقد يحتاج في وجه آخر منه إلى فهم عميق بالواقع مع اجتهاد في فهم كتاب الله. So sometimes it might be the understanding of when it comes to linking the ayat of the Quran to the waqi', sometimes it might be the difficulty might lie actually in the need for a deep understanding of the Quran to derive from it guidance for a particular issue that is arisen in our lives today. And sometimes it could be the opposite, that the guidance of the Quran, the guidance of the Sharia on certain principles might actually be clear, but knowing where to apply it might require a deep understanding of the situation at hand. So there's this sort of balance here, and we already discussed this a bit with the example of social media and technology and what have you. سورة الرابعة ربط التفسير بالمكتشفات العلمية الحديثة وتأثيرها في التفسير. An example of this is about the people who will be in the hellfire. Whenever their skin is burned up, we will change it with new skin so that they can taste the punishment, so they can experience the punishment. One of the interpretations of this verse is that julud, which the zahir of it, the apparent meaning of julud is skin. That is what jild is used for, skin. But there is an alternative interpretation that has been mentioned by some of the Mufassirin, that here it actually means sarabiluhum, meaning their garments that they will be wearing when they're in the hellfire. And they've taken this from the verse, another verse in the Quran, sarabiluhum min qatirani, that their garments are basically of tar. Says that, okay, so some of them said, well, what this means is that when their garments become burned up, they will be replaced with new ones. And they have certain justifications that they mention for it. That basically that, you know, if their skin is burned up, then it'll just be gone, and that necessitates that if the fire can burn up their skin, then it could also burn up the rest of their bodies. And so, you know, they would basically cease to exist. So they were coming at it from certain concerns, not realizing the relationship between the skin and the ability to feel the sensations of touch. And so this is something that, being aware of it, it supports this tafsir. And so again, that requires an ability, that requires someone who's capable of doing tafsir to make that link and bring these issues, new scientific discoveries, into play in the way that they're understanding or interpreting certain verses. السورة الخامسة أن يكون التجديد في التفسير مددا من الهداية القرآنية في العلوم السرية المستحدثة لا تستغني عنه. So basically the idea here is to take guidance from the Quran for some of the to illuminate some of the new ulum that have been introduced in the modern era, such as psychology and psychology and al-mutarbiyah here he mentions, I guess you would say pedagogy. Um, Basically, um, the Quran obviously being revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no one understands the human nafs better than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, obviously, the Quran was not revealed to explain issues of psychology, so you don't have a surah on psychology that certain verses that are dedicated to psychology and laying out principles of psychology. But uh, um, given Allah's having revealed the Quran for us to provide us guidance while understanding human psychology better than human beings could ever understand themselves, inevitably it will contain valuable insights. Um, so here he gives an example of this Dr. Salih al-Dosi, who sent him a sample of guidance for tarbiyah that he derived from this one verse. وأخي هارون هو أفصح مني لسانا فأرسله معي ردعا يصدقني إني أخاف أن يكذبون. So he mentions a host of different points, things about 20 some that he's derived guidance for tarbiyah. Points of tarbiyah, actually it's more, it's 25. Um, and if some of them are perhaps a bit of a stretch or debatable, then certainly there are others that are actually um, quite strong, and um, the verse clearly does support this idea. And so to go through the Quran in this fashion, and again, this is just from one verse. To go through the Quran in this fashion, there is a lot of guidance that can be taken from it that would uh, shed light um, on uh, on matters of akhlaq and matters of tarbiyah and psychology and other areas. سورة السادسة ضبط التفسير الإشاري المقبول وزيادة فيه تقعيدا وتطبيقا. This is Sheikh Hatim saying that laying out, there's still a need for further developing principles for and clarifying those principles for tafsir ishari. There's still ample scope for tahrir of linguistic issues that have a relationship with tafsir. An example of this is determining the root meanings of linguistic roots. See, مقاييس اللغة of Ibn Faris was an attempt at this, but Ibn Faris, the conclusions he reaches about the interpretations of words and about the interpretations of the root letters, that this root has this meaning, this root has this meaning, it's a matter of ijtihad. Now, with the capabilities that we have thanks to technology, there is considerable scope to expand on and to revise what Ibn Faris did. There are actually now some modern efforts, which I imagine that Sheikh Hatim will probably make reference to in the next edition of this work to come out. One is التحقيق في التحقيق في كلمات القرآن الكريم by Al-Mustafawi. He's a Shi'i scholar. He's written looking similar to what Ibn Faris did, looking at the root meanings, but focusing on the words of the Quran. It's published in 10 volumes. They're thin volumes, but it is 10 volumes. 10 volumes, or actually 14 volumes. And then Another work in uh, largely for the same purpose, if they're somewhat different in style and application. But another work of the same in the same vein is المعجم الاشتقاقي المؤصل of Sheikh Dr. Muhammad Hassan Jabal. Dr. Muhammad Hassan Jabal. Uh, it's in four, published originally in four large volumes. Both of these are attempts to discover the root meanings, and understanding the meaning of the roots can shed important light on our understanding of the meanings of the words, the subtle meanings of the words. Uh, so Sheikh Hatim points out here is that one thing that he's pointing out here is that given the tools that we now have with modern technology, it is possible for us to do istiqra of the lugha and to investigate the different ways in which words have been used in a fashion that was not possible before. And there are certain efforts that are ongoing to create what is called the mu'jam tarihi. So not exactly related to, somewhat related to what we're talking about, although its scope is bigger than what we're talking about. Because we're looking specifically at at understanding the words in the Quran, which obviously were revealed in the language at the time of revelation. These projects to develop a Mu'jam Tarihi are attempting to actually develop a corpus of the Arabic language through the ages that will allow the study of how words have been used in different times and places, and create a sort of, and part of that, it starts with actually creating a database of a linguistic corpus from which the 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 usage of words is being studied. Uh, in in uh, in in English, it would be called the corpus. In Arabic, it's typically referred to as al-mudawwana al-lughawiyya. So there's an attempt to create a corpus from all of these texts from which the usage of words can be studied. So if we look at, for example, the shi'r jahili and also the early Islamic shi'r from the early Islamic era that is still close to the time of revelation, and so words are still being used largely as the Arabs were using them at the time of revelation. Careful study of their usage can reveal, can help um, fine tune our understanding of the meaning of those words and how they were used. And then also in relation to what is being discussed here, the identifying the meaning of the root, and then that can also shed some light on the subtle connotations of the words and why a particular word was chosen in a particular place. So there's a lot of scope here um, for development, and this is something that, really, now that this tool is available to us, we have the ability to do this. We have the ability to create these databases. We have access to things that we didn't have access to. I mean, just with the Al-Maktaba Shamila, the sort of research that you can do in this regard, going through text and gathering information. Well, not that that is in and of itself sufficient. There's a need for doing much more than that. But having these tools available to us now, to not use them would be almost criminal. The 8th point he mentions is the lughawi ijaz of the Quran. Obviously, the ijaz of the Quran is not limited to its language, but the most important uh, manifestation of the Quran's ijaz, of its miraculous nature, is in its lugha, in its balagha. Um, One aspect of this is, as he says here, that uh, one thing that we can contribute to, and that is their scope for tajdeed, is presenting the balagha of the Quran, presenting the ijaz of the Quran in a fashion such that even a person who does not have a fine, refined appreciation for balagha, such that he uh, can truly appreciate eloquent speech and realize how eloquent it is, and compare it with and distinguish speech that is eloquent from speech that is not eloquent. There's a need for making that accessible uh, to such people who are laymen and who don't have that literary appreciation of the Arabic language. And of course, part of that is Sheikh Hatim didn't really mention this, but part of it is majority of the Ummah is not actually Arabic speaking to begin with. Just aside from the fact that even in the Arab world, amongst the Arab speakers, not everyone is able to appreciate this aspect of the balagha, particularly given that we're 1400 years now removed from the initial revelation and the language of revelation. That it requires a certain degree of study. It requires a certain degree of mastery that is not readily accessible to everyone, to appreciate the balagha of the Quran, to appreciate the ijaz of the Quran. But there are attempts that that make this appreciation accessible even to the average person. In the Arabic language, one thing that he mentions is, as an example, is التسوير الفني في القرآن by Sheikh Sayyid Qutb al-Shahid. And another example is the durus of Sheikh Muhammad Mutawalli al-Sha'rawi, obviously in Arabic, well, a lot of it actually in colloquial Arabic, in Ammiya. He did an excellent job of making the balagha of the Quran appreciable and accessible to the average listener. And there are many such efforts, and there's obviously plenty of scope to contribute to this. And sometimes it's just a matter of taking what is already there and simply packaging it. And then there's also scope for taking what is there and building on it in an original fashion, in a unique fashion, as we see with Sayyid Qutb's book, Taswir al-Fanni fil Quran. The ninth point that he brings up, the ninth scenario, the ninth area where there is scope, or the ninth type of tasdeed that is possible, al-qira'ah al-dakhiliyya lin-nass al-Qur'ani. Basically, he's talking about internal indications in the Quran that show that the source of the Quran is not the Prophet ﷺ, it's not a human being, but that the source is in fact Muhammad ﷺ. Amongst classical scholars, we see Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in Tathbit Dalal al-Nubuwah is an example of this. In the modern era, we have An-Naba al-Azim by Muhammad Abdullah Darraz, and Malik ibn Nabi also in his book Al-Bahira al-Qur'aniyya. Both these two books are actually translated into English. In fact, Sheikh Suhaib Saeed has done a series of lessons that are available on YouTube on Sheikh Darraz's book An-Naba al-Azim. I don't think he covered the whole of the book, but he covered aspects of the book. I'm not sure the details. Been about 10 lessons or so. But that would be a great place to start. I don't remember the title. Don't remember the English title of the series that he did, but it was on this book, An-Naba al-Azim of Sheikh Darraz. Then finally, the last one that Sheikh Hatim mentions is علوم تفسيرية ولدت في أصول المتأخرة فهي ولذلك فهي لم تنضج بعد. Basically, certain aspects of tafsir that developed in a later stage, and so the tafsir literature around them, the focus on them in tafsir literature is not as rich and not as detailed, not as developed as other aspects of tafsir, or in some cases very much undeveloped. Tanasub al-ayat, understanding the relationship between the ayat, the identifying the major themes of the surahs, the topics that are covered in the surah, and the relationship between that and the tafsir of individual verses in the surah, and then tafsir of qira'at, both the mutawatir and shadh. All of these areas, there is some work that has been done, but these are still relatively um, there's still a lot of scope for further development in these areas. Um, Particularly, I think the idea of maqasid al-sur. Amongst the classical scholars, you have al-Biqai spoke about this. He dealt with this. He applied it in his. He has a book actually on maqasid al-sur, and then also you see it reflected in his tafsir that he wrote. But then it's not a major area of focus until the modern era, and then there have been some modern efforts um, to look at the overarching themes of the surahs and to interpret the surah in light of those themes, or look at the effect of that on the interpretation of the individual verses of the surah. This is an area that still, is very much undeveloped, and there's plenty of scope for development. Even tanasub al-ayat, there's more discussion in the tafsir works about tanasub than there is about other areas, but then even with that, there's still plenty of scope for development. Tafsir al-qira'at probably has the most historical uh, impact in terms of hardly a book of tafsir will go without mentioning different qira'at, um, and then looking at the interpretation of those different qira'at, but there is still scope for further development here. That brings us to the end of the first part of the book. And inshallah, we'll pick up next week with the second half of the book, which is the actual program of study, an applied program that Sheikh Hatim has developed as a way for the person to walk through the student, the aspiring mufassir, to walk through step by step to actually practice being mufassir and to hone his skills, and also to discover the gaps in his knowledge, so as to build on that, experience, and become a mufassir بإذن الله تعالى. Okay, so we will conclude with that. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا